My name is Maribel Ferreira Cole, and I found out I'd been legally petitioned against by my own stepson 11 days before his high school graduation, when a process server knocked on my door at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning and handed me an envelope with my name on it while I was still in my bathrobe holding a coffee mug that said World's Okayest Cook, a gift Tyler had given me for Mother's Day when he was 9 years old. Inside was a motion for a protective order, filed in family court, requesting that I be barred from attending Tyler's graduation ceremony and from any recognition as a parent during the event. The motion cited, among other things, a sworn statement from Tyler himself, 17 years old at the time of filing, stating that I was never really his mother, and that my presence at the ceremony would cause him emotional distress. I had raised that boy since he was 6 years old. I had signed every school form, sat through every teacher conference, held his hand at his father's funeral 2 years earlier while he sobbed into my shoulder. And now, 11 days before he crossed a stage, I had watched him work 12 years to reach. A judge was going to decide whether I was allowed to be there at all. Welcome back to True Family Drama, the channel for real stories of betrayal, justice, and the family members who used a courtroom to try to rewrite a truth that a dozen years of ordinary Tuesdays had already made permanent. This is one of the hardest stories I've ever told, because unlike a lot of what you'll find on this channel, the person at the center of the betrayal was a child I loved, manipulated by an adult who should have known better. Stay with me through this one, because the way it ended involved a teacher's filing cabinet, 12 years of sign-in sheets, and a moment in that courtroom I don't think I'll ever fully stop replaying. If you're new here, subscribe, because there's a lot more like this waiting for you. To understand how a boy I helped raise ended up standing in a courtroom trying to erase me from his own life, you have to understand the years before it, because this story didn't start with a lawsuit. It started with a grief nobody in that family ever actually let itself finish. I met Daniel Cole 9 years ago at a community fundraiser for the elementary school where I taught art part-time, back before I left teaching to run my own small design studio. Daniel was a widower, his wife Renata having died of an aggressive brain tumor when Tyler was 4 years old, and by the time I met him, he was 38. Exhausted in the specific, permanent way single fathers of young children get exhausted, and cautiously, carefully rebuilding a life he'd assumed, for a while, might never feel whole again. Tyler was 6 when Daniel and I started dating, a serious, watchful little boy who took nearly a year to warm up to me, which I never once resented, because I understood, even then, that his caution wasn't about me personally. It was about the fact that the last time an important adult had changed in his life, that adult had died, and some part of his 6-year-old brain had apparently decided that new adults were, structurally, temporary. I want to tell you about the specific moment Tyler let me in, because I think it matters for everything that came after. Before that moment, though, I want to describe the year of careful, patient waiting that preceded it, because I think it's easy, telling a story like this in retrospect, to skip past the parts that felt uneventful at the time, but that actually built the entire foundation everything else stood on. For the first year Daniel and I dated, I made a rule for myself that I've never fully explained to anyone, not even Daniel at the time. I would never initiate physical affection with Tyler, never push for a hug or a kiss goodnight, never ask him directly whether he liked me. I let him set every single pace, because I understood, even without any formal training in child psychology, that a boy who'd lost his mother at 4 years old needed to feel like he had actual control over how much of himself he handed to the next adult who entered his life. I remember specific small moments from that year with a clarity that surprises me even now. The first time he let me read him a bedtime story instead of insisting on Daniel. The first time he showed me a drawing he'd made without Daniel prompting him to. The first Saturday morning he wandered into the kitchen where I was making pancakes and simply sat down at the table without being asked, a gesture so small it would be invisible in any other context. And that felt, to me, like being handed something enormously fragile and enormously important at the same time. About 14 months into dating Daniel, I picked Tyler up from school on a day Daniel had a work emergency, and Tyler, sitting in the back seat of my car, asked me, out of nowhere, in the flat, testing voice of a child checking whether an adult can be trusted with something real, "Are you going to leave like my mom did?" I didn't flinch, though everything in me wanted to. I told him the truth, the only truth I actually had, that I couldn't promise nothing bad would ever happen, because nobody could promise that, not even to their own kids. But I told him I intended to stay, on purpose, every single day, for as long as he'd let me, and that staying wasn't the same thing as a guarantee, it was a choice I was going to keep making. He was quiet for the rest of the car ride. 2 days later, he drew me a picture at school. A stick figure family, him in the middle, Daniel on one side, and me on the other, labeled in careful 7-year-old handwriting, Dad, me, and Mari. Not Dad's girlfriend. Mari. I still have that drawing, framed, in my studio. Daniel and I married when Tyler was 8, and I formally adopted him as a step-parent 2 years later, a legal process Daniel initiated specifically because, in his words, "I don't want there to be any ambiguity about who this kid's family is, on paper or otherwise." I want you to understand that detail clearly, because it matters enormously to what happened years later. My relationship to Tyler was not informal, not a step-parent by marriage alone with no legal standing. I was, by court order, his legal parent, with full parental rights, a status Daniel had pursued deliberately, thoughtfully, because he understood, having lost Renata, exactly how fragile a child's sense of family security could become if the adults around him left anything unclear. For the next 7 years, I did what I think most parents do without ever cataloging it as remarkable. I went to every parent-teacher conference, chaperoned 4 field trips, sat in the stands for 11 years of Little League and then high school baseball, signed every permission slip, filled out every emergency contact form, sat up with Tyler through 2 broken bones, a bout of pneumonia in 6th grade that had us in the ER at 2 in the morning, and the ordinary daily rhythm of packed lunches and homework help, and driving him to and from 100 practices and rehearsals I never once resented, because that's simply what being someone's mother actually is, underneath all the legal language, showing up specifically on the unglamorous, ordinary days nobody's keeping score of, until eventually those days add up to something nobody should be able to argue away. I want to describe a few of those years in more specific detail, because I think the accumulated weight of ordinary days is exactly what got contested in that courtroom years later, and I don't want to skip past the texture of them here either. Tyler struggled with reading in 2nd grade, badly enough that his teacher recommended testing for a possible learning difference. And I remember the specific 18 months that followed: nightly reading practice at our kitchen table, flashcards I made myself out of index cards, a small chart on the refrigerator tracking his progress that he insisted on decorating himself with stickers shaped like dinosaurs, because dinosaurs were, that year, the organizing passion of his entire 7-year-old existence. I remember the exact evening, in the spring of 3rd grade, when he read an entire chapter book out loud to me without stumbling once, and the specific, enormous pride on his face when he finished, looking up at me for confirmation that he'd actually done it, and how I had to leave the room for a moment afterward so he wouldn't see me cry over something that felt, to me, like watching a boy overcome something that could have quietly shaped how he saw his own capability for the rest of his life. I remember his first Little League season, when he was 7, playing right field with the specific, endearing distractibility of a child who was more interested in the clouds overhead than the actual game, and how Daniel and I would trade off innings sitting in the bleachers, both of us there every single Saturday, regardless of whose turn it technically was to be in charge, because neither of us wanted to miss a single one of his games, even on the days it wasn't strictly required. I remember middle school, the specific brutal social terrain of it, and the several nights I sat on the edge of his bed while he cried about a friend group that had quietly excluded him, offering the kind of practical, unglamorous comfort that doesn't fix anything but simply makes a child feel less alone inside a problem no adult can actually solve for them. None of these memories, on their own, would have mattered much in a courtroom. Together, accumulated across 11 years, they became the exact thing Eleanor's petition tried, 18 months later, to argue had never really existed at all. Daniel died 2 years ago, suddenly, of an undiagnosed cardiac arrhythmia, collapsing during a Saturday morning run in our neighborhood, found by a jogger who called 911 but couldn't revive him before paramedics arrived. Tyler was 15, I was 43. And in the space of a single Saturday morning, we became, in a phrase I've come to hate for how clinically it describes something so enormous, a blended family that had suddenly and permanently lost the one person who'd originally blended it. Grief did something to Tyler that I understood, intellectually, even as I watched it happen, and understanding it never once made it easier to live through. I want to describe the specific texture of that first year after Daniel's death in more detail, because I think it's the year that made everything afterward possible, and I don't want to rush past it. The house felt, for months, like it was holding its breath. I remember the first time I had to sign a school form alone, without Daniel's second signature beside mine, the way it had always appeared for 11 years. And how strange it felt. How the blank space where his handwriting used to go seemed to announce itself on every single form I touched that year. Tyler and I attended grief counseling together for the first 4 months, a family therapist named Dr. Whitcomb who specialized in adolescent loss. And I remember those sessions as some of the only spaces that year where Tyler and I still felt genuinely connected. Sitting across from each other in a quiet office, saying things out loud we couldn't quite manage to say at home, where the absence of Daniel's laugh from the next room felt too enormous to speak around directly. It was Dr. Whitcomb, actually, who first gently flagged something to me that I wish, in retrospect, I had taken more seriously at the time. About 3 months into our sessions, she mentioned, carefully, that Tyler had started referencing Eleanor's house as somewhere he felt he could just be sad about my mom without it being weird. A phrase that, at the time, I interpreted charitably, even gratefully. Of course, a boy who'd lost his mother at 4 deserved a place where that specific grief, distinct from his father's death, could exist without competing for space with everything else happening in our own house. I didn't yet understand that weird was a word Tyler had absorbed from somewhere else, a word that implied our own home, and my own presence in it was somehow an obstacle to grieving Renata honestly. I think, looking back, that was the first small crack Eleanor had already begun opening, months before I had any language for what was actually happening. I gave him space, because every book on grief counseling I devoured in those first months told me to, and because my own grief for Daniel was enormous enough that some days giving him space was as much about my own limited capacity as it was genuinely good parenting advice. I want to be honest about my own grief that year, because I think it matters to understanding why I didn't intervene sooner. I was myself a 43-year-old widow, grieving a marriage I'd expected to have for decades longer, running a design studio I could barely focus on, managing a household that had once had 2 adults dividing its weight and now had exactly 1. There were entire weeks that year where simply getting Tyler to school and myself to work felt like the outer limit of what I could manage. And I think, honestly, some part of me was quietly relieved in those early months that Eleanor was willing to absorb some of the emotional labor of Tyler's grief that I genuinely did not have full capacity to carry alone. I don't say that to excuse what came later. I say it because I think it's important, in a story like this, to be honest about the specific vulnerabilities that made space for a manipulation like Eleanor's to take root in the first place. Not because I was a bad or negligent parent, but because grief, real grief, genuinely does leave gaps. And someone patient enough and motivated enough can walk through those gaps slowly, over many months, long before anyone left standing has the clarity to notice what's actually happening. Eleanor and I had always had what I'd describe as a distant, correct relationship. She'd never been unkind to me exactly, but she'd also never fully warmed to the fact that her deceased daughter's son called another woman mom. A wound I understood, even sympathized with, without ever fully grasping how deep it actually ran in her until Daniel was no longer alive to serve as the buffer between us. Eleanor Whitfield, Tyler's maternal grandmother, had walked directly into the space my grief and Tyler's silence had left open that year, and had filled it, patiently, with a story about our family that I never saw coming until it had already taken root. Tyler had, over those same months, withdrawn, first from his friends, then gradually from me, retreating into a silence that felt less like ordinary teenage moodiness and more like a wound he didn't have language for yet, a silence Eleanor, I would later understand, had been quietly, carefully filling in with her own version of events. In the months after the funeral, Eleanor began inviting Tyler to spend increasing amounts of time at her house, ostensibly to give him connection to his mother's side of the family, a request I never once tried to block, because I believed then, and still believe now, that Tyler deserved every possible thread of connection to Renata that he could hold on to. What I didn't realize, until much later, was that those visits had slowly become something else entirely, a space where Eleanor, quietly, patiently, over 18 months, began retelling the story of our family in a way that gradually wrote me out of it. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make Eleanor into a cartoon villain the way I think it would be easy to do given what eventually happened. I believe, genuinely, that Eleanor's actions came from a real and devastating grief of her own. The grief of a mother who had lost her daughter far too young, watching that daughter's son grow up calling someone else mom, a title Eleanor may have quietly believed for over a decade belonged only to Renata's memory. I think Daniel's death cracked something open in Eleanor that had been sealed shut for years by simple politeness, and once it cracked, she found, in her grieving, silence-prone grandson, an audience finally receptive to a version of the story she'd apparently been carrying for over a decade, without ever saying it out loud. The shift in Tyler was gradual enough that I initially mistook it for ordinary grief evolving in ordinary ways. He started referring to me, in conversation with friends I'd occasionally overhear, as my stepmom instead of my mom, a phrase he hadn't used since he was 7 years old, drawing that stick figure family. He began spending more weekends at Eleanor's, less time at home. He grew short with me over small things, a curfew reminder, a request to unload the dishwasher, in a way that felt less like teenage friction and more like a boy testing whether I'd finally give him a reason to justify a distance he was already, quietly, being coached toward. I found out how deliberate that coaching had actually been about 4 months before the protective order, when Tyler's guidance counselor, a warm, perceptive woman named Ms. Okafor, called me in for a meeting ostensibly about his college applications and mentioned, carefully, almost apologetically, that Tyler had written an early draft of his college essay, a draft he hadn't submitted, one Ms. Okafor had only seen because he'd asked her to review it before deciding not to use it, about losing both his parents, describing his father's death and, in the same breath, describing me, his living, present stepmother, in language that suggested I had somehow also been lost to him, emotionally, in the same period. Ms. Okafor told me she'd found the essay concerning enough that she'd gently probed Tyler about it, and that he'd told her, almost verbatim, a phrase I would later hear again in a courtroom. My mom's mom says I don't have to pretend Mari is really my mother just because my dad married her. My mom's mom, Eleanor, actively, explicitly telling a grieving 15-year-old that he didn't have to pretend a relationship that had been the entire architecture of his childhood was real. I confronted Eleanor directly after that meeting, as calmly as I could manage given how much that conversation had shaken me. She didn't deny it. Not really, she told me, with a kind of composed conviction that chilled me more than outright hostility would have, that she felt Tyler deserved to know he's allowed to have complicated feelings about his family situation, and that she'd never told him anything that wasn't, in her words, fundamentally true. You were never his biological mother, Maribel, and I don't think it's healthy for a child to be pressured into pretending otherwise forever. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that biology had never been the thing that made someone a parent in our family, that Daniel himself had legally adopted that principle into our lives specifically because he understood how much it mattered, and that whatever grief she was working through about Renata did not entitle her to dismantle the only stable parental relationship her grandson had left. She told me she'd think about softening her language around Tyler. I don't believe, looking back, that she ever did. I want to walk you through the 18 months between that conversation and the protective order, because I think the slow, patient nature of what Eleanor did matters as much as the filing itself. This wasn't a single dramatic betrayal. It was an accumulation. A comment here, a reframed memory there, an increasing number of weekends at Eleanor's house, where I suspect, though I can't prove with certainty, that Tyler was gently, repeatedly told a version of our family history, in which I was a well-meaning but fundamentally peripheral figure, someone his father had chosen, not someone he himself had ever truly needed to choose back. By Tyler's senior year, our relationship had eroded to something I barely recognized from the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. He was polite to me, mostly, in the careful, distant way you're polite to a landlord rather than a parent. He'd moved, functionally, to living primarily with Eleanor by that spring, an arrangement I hadn't formally fought, partly because Tyler was 17, and legally I had limited practical ability to force a teenager to live somewhere he was actively resisting, and partly, I'll admit, because I was terrified that fighting too hard would confirm whatever version of me Eleanor had been quietly building in his head, the controlling stepmother, unwilling to let him choose his own family. I chose, instead, to keep showing up in the ways that were still available to me. I still texted him every morning. I still attended every school event I was permitted to attend, sitting quietly in the back where I wouldn't cause a scene, watching a boy I'd raised for 11 years grow increasingly, carefully unreachable. The protective order landed 11 days before graduation, and I want to describe reading it in detail because I think the specific language mattered enormously to how devastating it actually was. It wasn't simply a request that I not attend. It was framed, legally, as an emergency motion citing ongoing emotional distress. I was allegedly causing Tyler, through what the filing described as persistent, unwanted attempts to assert a maternal role the respondent does not hold. The respondent. That's how the document referred to me, throughout, 11 pages of legal language, reducing 11 years of packed lunches and emergency room nights, and a framed crayon drawing to a single clinical designation, respondent. Attached was a sworn declaration from Tyler himself, 17 years old, stating, in language that read, even to me in that first devastated reading, like it had been shaped by someone else's hand guiding his own, that I was never really his mother, that Renata was his only real mother, and that having me present at graduation, potentially announced or recognized as a parent during the ceremony, would cause him significant emotional harm. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long time after reading that filing. The same kitchen floor where, years earlier, I'd sat sorting through hospital paperwork the night Daniel died. I called my sister, Camila, who is a family law paralegal, before I called an actual attorney, mostly because I needed someone who loved me to help me understand what I was looking at before I could face a stranger with it. Camilla read the filing over the phone with me, section by section, and her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a specific, careful calm I recognized from every crisis she'd ever helped me through. Mari, she said, this isn't really about a graduation ceremony. This is Eleanor using Tyler as a vehicle to formally, legally erase your parental status on the record, permanently, in a way that could affect a lot more than one ceremony if it succeeds. You need a real attorney today, Not tomorrow. I retained an attorney the next morning, a family law specialist named Deborah Kowalczyk, recommended by Camilla's firm, a woman with the specific unshakable calm of someone who has spent 2 decades watching families do their worst to each other and has stopped being surprised by any of it, though she told me, honestly, in our very first meeting, that this particular filing was among the more emotionally brutal ones she'd handled in years, precisely because of how it weaponized a genuinely grieving child's own voice against the parent who'd actually raised him. I want to describe that first meeting with Deborah in a little more detail, because it was, in its own way, the moment I stopped being purely a devastated stepmother and started becoming someone actively capable of fighting for what I knew was true. Her office was small, unglamorous, stacked with case files in a way that felt oddly reassuring rather than chaotic. The office of someone who did the actual unglamorous work rather than performing polish for clients. She read the entire filing in front of me, silently, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 15 minutes, occasionally making small notes in the margin. And when she finally looked up, she didn't offer me false comfort or a rehearsed pep talk. She said plainly, "This is going to hurt, reading it again in a courtroom, hearing it read by strangers. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I've read a lot of filings built entirely on genuine fact, and a lot built on manipulation dressed up as fact. And this one has the specific texture of the second kind. We're going to find the paper trail that proves it." I remember feeling, for the first time since the process server had shown up at my door, something other than pure devastation. A small, steady flicker of the same determination I imagine every parent in these stories eventually finds once they understand that grief alone won't fix what's happened, but evidence, patiently gathered, actually might. Her first move was to pull the full procedural history, and what she found clarified something I hadn't fully understood about the legal mechanics of what Eleanor had actually orchestrated. Because I held full legal parental rights through my formal adoption years earlier, Eleanor could not simply request, on her own standing, that I be barred from a school event. She had no direct legal authority over Tyler's relationship with me at all. What she'd done instead, cleverly and, Deborah noted with real professional frustration, cynically, was engineer the filing to originate from Tyler himself, now old enough at 17, nearly 18, to be treated by the court with some degree of independent voice in matters directly concerning his own emotional well-being, even though the underlying legal architecture of the request, the language, the citations, the procedural framing, read, to Deborah's trained eye, unmistakably like something drafted with significant adult legal assistance rather than composed independently by a grieving teenager. "Someone helped him file this," Deborah told me, possibly a sympathetic attorney friend of Eleanor's, possibly Eleanor herself pulling language from other filings she found online. Either way, Mari, I don't think for one second that a 17-year-old wrote persistent, unwanted attempts to assert a maternal role the respondent does not hold, entirely on his own. I want to pause here and talk directly to you for a moment, because I know some of you watching have lived some version of this. Not necessarily a courtroom, but the specific, devastating experience of watching an adult manipulate a child you love into becoming the instrument of your own erasure. There is a particular kind of grief in that, one I don't think gets talked about enough, because it asks you to hold two things at once that feel impossible to hold together. Genuine compassion for a child who is, himself, being used and hurt in ways he doesn't fully understand yet, and genuine righteous anger at the adult orchestrating it from behind the curtain. I felt both of those things simultaneously for the entire 11 days leading up to that hearing, and I don't think I ever fully resolved the tension between them. I don't think you're supposed to. Deborah's strategy, once we'd reviewed everything, was not to attack Tyler's stated feelings directly. She was adamant about this from our very first meeting, and I'm grateful for it now in ways I wasn't fully able to appreciate in the moment. We are not going to make this hearing about proving Tyler is lying, or coached, or wrong to feel however he feels, she told me. We are going to make it about the objective, documented record of who actually showed up for this child, consistently, for 11 years, regardless of what any single sworn statement claims in a moment of grief and manipulation. Facts don't need Tyler to feel a particular way about them in order to remain true. That distinction became the entire architecture of our case, and it's the reason, I think, that what happened in that courtroom ultimately unfolded the way it did. Deborah requested, and received, an expedited hearing given the graduation timeline, scheduling us in family court just 6 days before the ceremony, a compressed window that left almost no time to build the kind of case I imagine most attorneys would want for a matter this consequential. Deborah moved anyway, methodically, gathering what records she could in the time available. My formal adoption decree, obviously, establishing my full legal parental status beyond any dispute. Medical records showing me listed as Tyler's primary emergency contact and consenting parent across 11 years of pediatrician visits, the pneumonia hospitalization, 2 broken bones. School records showing my signature on permission slips, my attendance at parent-teacher conferences, my name listed as primary guardian contact on Tyler's enrollment forms every single year since I'd married Daniel. And then, 4 days before the hearing, Deborah found the piece of evidence that ended up mattering more than any document I could have produced myself, because it came from someone with absolutely no stake in either side of this fight. Someone whose only interest was the plain, unglamorous truth, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet for over a decade. Mrs. Alvarez had been Tyler's third-grade teacher, the year we'd started dating, and had gone on to become the school's longtime attendance coordinator, a role she'd held for over 15 years by the time any of this happened, meticulously maintaining, as part of the school district's own record-keeping requirements, sign-in and sign-out logs for every parent pickup, every field trip chaperone, every parent-teacher conference attendance across the entire elementary school. I want to describe the phone call between Deborah and Mrs. Alvarez in a bit more detail, because Deborah later told me it was one of the more unexpectedly moving conversations of her entire career. She'd called expecting, at best, a vague secondhand recollection of a family from over a decade earlier, the kind of foggy memory most people retain about a single family among thousands of students across a long career. Instead, Mrs. Alvarez answered almost immediately with specifics, telling Deborah, within the first 2 minutes of the call, "Oh, I remember the Cole family very well. The mother, well, the stepmother, though I never once thought of her that way, was one of the most consistently present parents I had in 31 years of teaching. I actually still have my old binders, if that's useful to you. I've always kept them, long after the school stopped requiring it. You'd be surprised how often it matters later that someone kept an honest record." Deborah told me she'd had to sit quietly on the phone for a moment after that sentence, struck by the specific, unglamorous heroism of a woman who'd simply decided, decades earlier, that careful record-keeping was a form of care in its own right, never imagining it would someday matter this much to a family she hadn't thought about in years. Deborah, working a lead from Ms. Okafor, the guidance counselor, contacted Mrs. Alvarez directly to ask whether any archived records from Tyler's elementary years might still exist. Mrs. Alvarez, retired now but still living in town, not only remembered Tyler and me clearly, she had, remarkably, kept her own personal binder of attendance and involvement logs across her career, a habit she'd developed early on, she explained to Deborah, specifically because she'd seen too many custody disputes over the years where a parent's actual involvement became contested territory, and she'd decided, quietly, that keeping careful records was simply good practice for a teacher who cared about the kids passing through her classroom. What Mrs. Alvarez's records showed, laid out across 11 years in her careful, old-fashioned handwriting, was almost unbearably precise. My name, Mej Ferreira Cole, appeared as the pickup parent on 211 separate documented occasions across Tyler's elementary years alone. My signature appeared on every single field trip permission slip Mrs. Alvarez had personally collected during the 2 years Tyler was in her class. A note, dated from Tyler's third-grade year, in Mrs. Alvarez's own handwriting, read, T. Cole had rough morning, missing dad. Mari stayed until he settled, missed her own 9 a.m. meeting to do it. A memory I hadn't consciously thought about in years, resurfacing suddenly in a stranger's careful cursive, proof that some ordinary Tuesday I'd long since forgotten had, in fact, been recorded, quietly, by someone paying closer attention than I ever realized at the time. I want to describe the hearing itself now because I think, more than anything else in this story, it's the part that actually changed something permanent, not just legally but inside me. I want to describe the morning of the hearing before I describe the hearing itself, because I think the waiting mattered almost as much as what happened once we were inside that courtroom. I hadn't slept more than a few broken hours the night before, and I remember standing in my closet that morning for an unreasonably long time, trying to decide what to wear, as though the right blazer might somehow communicate, wordlessly, 11 years of devotion in a way that felt suddenly, absurdly urgent to get right. Deborah met me outside the courthouse 20 minutes early, and I remember her handing me a coffee she'd bought without asking and saying simply, Whatever happens in there today, Mari, the truth of what you did for that boy doesn't change based on one ruling. I need you to hold on to that before we walk in, not just after. I didn't fully believe her in that moment. I believe her completely now. We appeared before a family court judge named Judge Priyanka Bhatt, a woman Deborah described beforehand as exacting, unsentimental, and deeply unimpressed by cases that arrived, as she put it, dressed up in more legal drama than the underlying facts actually require. Eleanor sat beside her own attorney at the opposing table, and Tyler sat beside her, 17 years old, in a blazer I recognized from his father's funeral 2 years earlier, his expression carefully arranged into something between defiance and a discomfort he wasn't quite managing to hide. Eleanor's attorney opened by walking through the emotional core of the petition. Tyler's sworn declaration, read aloud in the courtroom, his own words describing me as someone who was never really his mother, his claim that my presence at graduation would cause him genuine distress. I want to be honest that hearing those words read aloud, in a courtroom, in Tyler's own recorded voice from his sworn statement, was one of the most physically painful moments of my adult life. More painful, in some specific way I still can't fully articulate, than the day Daniel died. Because Daniel's death had been an accident of biology, nobody's fault, nothing I could have prevented no matter how carefully I'd loved him. This felt, instead, like watching 11 years of a real mutual relationship get narrated, in a courtroom, as though it had never actually existed at all. Deborah's response, when it came, was quiet, methodical, and utterly devastating in its restraint. She didn't attack Tyler's declaration directly. She simply began entering the documentary record, one piece at a time, into evidence. The adoption decree, establishing, as a matter of settled law, that I was Tyler's legal parent regardless of biology, a status neither Eleanor nor Tyler's declaration had any legal standing to unilaterally revoke. The medical records, the school enrollment forms. And then, finally, Mrs. Alvarez's binder, which Deborah had subpoenaed as a formal record, walking the judge through page after page of a decade of ordinary Tuesdays, documented not by me, not by anyone with any stake in this dispute, but by a retired elementary school teacher who had simply, quietly, done her job carefully enough for 15 years that the truth had accumulated in her filing cabinet whether anyone ever intended to need it or not. Judge Bat asked, at one point, whether Mrs. Alvarez was present and willing to testify directly, and Deborah confirmed she was, waiting in the hallway. What followed is the moment I think about most, more than the ruling itself, More than anything, Eleanor's attorney argued. Mrs. Alvarez took the stand, 71 years old, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the gravity of the room, in the specific way I think only decades of standing in front of 8-year-olds can actually prepare a person for. She was asked, simply, to describe what she remembered about Tyler's elementary years, and she did, at length, without a single note of drama in her voice, describing me at pickup, at conferences, at the third-grade Halloween parade, where I'd apparently, according to a detail I'd genuinely forgotten until she said it, dressed as a dinosaur because Tyler had begged me to match his own costume. "I've taught for 31 years," Mrs. Alvarez told the courtroom. In a moment, Deborah later told me she couldn't have scripted better if she'd tried. "I've seen a lot of parents come through my classroom door, some biological, some not. I stopped, a long time ago, thinking that distinction told me anything useful about who a child's real parent actually is. What tells me is who shows up. Mrs. Ferreira Cole showed up. 211 times by my own count, just in the years I personally logged. I don't know what's happened in this family since Daniel passed, and it's not my place to guess. But I know what I wrote down, in real time, with no reason to lie about any of it, for 11 years. I watched Tyler's face while Mrs. Alvarez spoke, and something shifted in it that I don't think I'll ever forget. Not dramatically, not a sudden collapse into tears, but something quieter, a kind of recognition moving across a 17-year-old's face in real time, as though he was hearing, for the first time in 2 years, a version of his own childhood that hadn't been curated, retold, or gently reshaped by anyone with a stake in how he remembered it. I think, watching him in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself believe until then. That some part of Tyler had never actually stopped knowing the truth. He'd simply been given, patiently, over 18 months, permission to set that truth aside in favor of a story that let him feel closer to a mother he'd lost too young to properly grieve. Mrs. Alvarez's binder didn't tell Tyler anything he didn't, on some buried level, already know. It just made it safe, finally, in front of a judge, for him to stop pretending otherwise. Judge Batt's ruling, when it came, was measured but unambiguous. She denied the protective order in full, noting on the record that the petition's underlying claim, that I held no legitimate maternal role in Tyler's life, was directly contradicted by both the formal legal record of my adoption and an extensive, independently documented history of parental involvement spanning over a decade. She was notably careful, and I've come to respect this enormously in retrospect, not to characterize Tyler as having lied, instead using language that acknowledged his genuine grief while firmly separating that grief from the legal and factual question actually before the court. "A child's evolving feelings during grief," she said, reading from careful notes, "however real and however painful, do not retroactively alter a legally established parental relationship, nor do they erase a documented history that exists independently of anyone's current emotional state." She denied the motion, ruled that I retained full legal standing to attend and be recognized at the graduation ceremony, and, in a detail Deborah told me afterward was somewhat unusual for this kind of hearing, added a verbal note directed gently at both Eleanor and Tyler, suggesting that whatever grief was driving this conflict deserved actual family therapy far more than it deserved a courtroom. I want to tell you what happened after the hearing, because I think it matters as much as the ruling itself. Tyler didn't run to me in the hallway, didn't apologize dramatically, didn't produce the kind of clean, cinematic reconciliation I think part of me had been quietly hoping for, despite knowing better. What happened instead was smaller, and I've come to believe, more honest. He caught my eye across the courthouse hallway, held it for a long moment, and then looked away first, his jaw tight, clearly overwhelmed by something he didn't yet have words for. I didn't approach him. Deborah had warned me, gently, that pushing too hard in that moment could do more harm than good, That whatever repair was possible needed to happen on a timeline that respected how much this had already cost him too, however much of it wasn't his fault. The graduation happened 6 days later, and I attended, sitting exactly where I'd always sat, in the family section. No announcement, no recognition beyond what every parent in that gymnasium received. I didn't need a formal recognition by that point. I needed, simply, to be present, unbarred, in the same room as a boy I'd raised for 11 years, watching him cross a stage his father never got to see him reach. I watched him scan the crowd as he walked, and when his eyes found mine, he didn't smile exactly, but he nodded. Once. A small, specific gesture that told me more than any sworn statement, in either direction, ever could. Tyler and I did not immediately repair our relationship after that hearing, and I want to be honest about that, because I think tidy endings are for people who weren't actually there. I want to describe the specific texture of those first few careful months after the hearing, because I think it matters more than a summary could convey. Tyler graduated and moved into his college dorm about 2 months later, 3 hours from home, and our contact during that transition was, if I'm honest, almost painfully polite. Brief texts about logistics, a stilted phone call on his first night in the dorm that lasted exactly 6 minutes. Neither of us quite sure how to bridge the distance that 18 months of Eleanor's careful storytelling and one devastating courtroom hearing had opened between us, even with the legal matter fully resolved in my favor. I remember driving home from move-in day and crying in my car in a way I hadn't let myself cry during the entire ordeal with the protective order, because there's a particular kind of grief in winning a legal battle to remain someone's mother and then watching that same someone drive off into a life where you're still, functionally, uncertain of your place in it. He moved out to attend college 2 months later, and our contact, for the first several months, remained careful, sparse, the kind of relationship that exists mostly through occasional texts that don't quite reach toward anything deeper. I want to describe a few of the small moments that slowly, unevenly, began to change that distance, because I think they matter more than any single dramatic turning point could. About 6 weeks into his first semester, Tyler texted me a photo of a dinosaur-shaped keychain he'd found in a campus bookstore. No caption, just the photo, and I understood immediately what he meant by it. A quiet, wordless reference back to that Halloween parade costume from 3rd grade. A small thread reaching across the distance without either of us having to name what we were actually trying to say. I bought a matching keychain and mailed it to him without any note explaining why, and he texted back a single word, obviously, that felt, in that moment, like the first genuine warmth between us in nearly 2 years. There was a difficult stretch in October of that first semester when Tyler called me late one night, clearly upset, struggling with a philosophy course he was convinced he was going to fail, spiraling in the specific, catastrophizing way 18-year-olds away from home for the first time sometimes do at 11 at night. I talked him through it for over an hour, the way I had talked him through countless smaller crises over 11 years of parenting, and at the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Thanks, Mom. Sorry, I mean," and stopped himself, clearly startled by his own slip, unsure whether the word was still allowed. I told him, as gently as I could manage while my heart was doing something complicated in my chest, that it had never stopped being allowed, that it never would be, regardless of what any courtroom or any grandmother's story had tried to argue in between. He didn't say much after that, but he also didn't correct himself again on our next several calls, and gradually, without either of us ever formally discussing it, Mom simply became the word again, the way it had been for 11 years before Eleanor's careful campaign tried to take it away. What changed it eventually wasn't a single dramatic conversation. It was, appropriately I think, a slow accumulation of small, ordinary gestures, not unlike the 211 pickups that had built our relationship in the first place. I want to mention one more moment before I move toward the end of this story, because it's the one that finally let me feel, fully, that we'd found our way back to something solid. Tyler came home for Thanksgiving that first semester, And on the drive back from the airport, unprompted, he told me he wanted to talk about the hearing, something we had, by mutual unspoken agreement, avoided discussing directly in the months since. He told me that in the weeks leading up to filing the petition, Eleanor had shown him old photographs of Renata almost every visit, had talked, repeatedly, about how much Renata would have wanted to be remembered as his real mother, how she'd framed my presence, gently but persistently, as something that risked crowding out his memory of a woman he could barely remember on his own. I think I let her tell me that story because it made missing Mom feel like it mattered more, he said, staring out the car window rather than at me. Like if I let you be my mom too, it meant I was forgetting her, and I didn't want to forget her, so I let Grandma convince me I had to choose. I told him, as evenly as I could manage while driving, that he had never needed to choose, that loving Renata's memory and loving me had never actually been in competition, no matter how convincingly Eleanor had made it feel that way. He was quiet for a long time after that, and then he said, very simply, I know that now. I think some part of me always knew it, actually. I just needed someone to be sad with me who understood exactly what I'd lost, and Grandma understood that specific loss in a way you couldn't, and I let that understanding turn into something it shouldn't have. That conversation, more than the ruling itself, is the moment I consider our actual reconciliation, because it was the first time Tyler named, clearly and in his own words, what had actually happened to him during those 18 months, without minimizing it, without excusing it, and without asking me to simply move past it, without ever being told the truth. A phone call, unprompted, on the 1-year anniversary of his father's death, where he cried for the first time in front of me in over 2 years, and told me, through the crying, I think I let Grandma tell me a story because it was easier than being sad about 2 people instead of 1. I didn't need him to apologize formally for the courtroom, and he never fully has, not in so many words. What he's given me instead, slowly, over the 2 years since, has felt more valuable than an apology ever could. A gradual, deliberate return to calling me Mom again, unprompted, in ordinary conversation, the way he used to before grief and Eleanor's careful storytelling ever intervened. My relationship with Eleanor has not recovered, and I don't expect it ever will. I don't say that with anger, not anymore, though I carried a great deal of it for a long time. I say it with a kind of settled clarity that some relationships, once someone has shown you exactly what they're capable of doing to protect their own version of a story, simply can't be rebuilt on the same trust that existed before. I saw Eleanor exactly once after the hearing, at a small gathering Tyler organized about 8 months later to scatter some of his father's ashes at a lake Daniel had loved, a gathering I attended and Eleanor attended separately, the two of us maintaining a careful, wide distance across the same small crowd of family friends. She approached me once, near the end of the afternoon, and said without quite meeting my eyes, I don't expect you to understand what it's like to lose a daughter and then watch someone else get called what she should have been called. I told her, as gently as I could manage in that specific grief-heavy setting, that I did understand grief reshaping people into versions of themselves capable of things they'd never otherwise have done, and that I didn't hate her for what had happened, even though I would never again trust her the way I once had. She didn't respond to that, just nodded once, and walked back toward her own small cluster of family, and I understood, watching her go, that this was likely the closest either of us would ever come to any kind of resolution between us. I've made peace with that. Some relationships end not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that too much has happened to ever fully repair, and I've come to believe there's a kind of honesty in accepting that ending, rather than performing a reconciliation neither of us would actually mean. I've made peace with the fact that Tyler will likely maintain some relationship with her regardless, because she is, whatever else she's done, a genuine link to the mother he lost too young to remember well, and I have never once tried to take that connection away from him, even in the worst of everything. I've simply, finally, stopped extending Eleanor the benefit of the doubt I once mistakenly believed was owed to every member of a family, regardless of what they'd actually done inside it. I think about Mrs. Alvarez often. The way I imagine everyone telling a story like this eventually comes to think about whichever quiet professional's ordinary diligence became the hinge their whole situation turned on. She didn't know, keeping that binder for 15 years, that she was building anything other than good professional practice. She certainly never imagined a courtroom, a grieving teenager, a grandmother's quiet campaign to rewrite a family's history. She was simply a teacher who decided, early in her career, that paying careful attention to who actually shows up for a child was worth writing down, even when nobody was asking her to. I visited Mrs. Alvarez in person about a month after the hearing, mostly because a thank you note felt insufficient for what her ordinary diligence had actually made possible. She invited me in for tea, and we sat in her small, book-lined living room for over an hour, talking not about the hearing directly, but about Tyler as a small boy, memories she still carried with a specificity that astonished me. She told me she'd actually started keeping her binders decades earlier, after watching a different family go through a bitter, damaging custody dispute, where a genuinely devoted parent had no way to prove, formally, how consistently they'd shown up, simply because nobody had ever thought to document it in real time before it became necessary. I decided then, she told me, pouring tea with the same unhurried calm she'd shown on the witness stand, that I would rather have 15 years of records nobody ever needed than one family who needed them and didn't have them. I asked her whether she'd ever imagined, keeping those records all those years, that they might someday matter this much to a family sitting right in front of her. She smiled and said simply, "No, but that's rather the point of keeping good records, isn't it? You don't keep them because you expect to need them. You keep them because you might." I sent her flowers after the hearing, along with a note I've since heard she keeps on her refrigerator, and I think about her handwriting sometimes. Still, that note from Tyler's third-grade year. Missed her own 9 a.m. meeting to do it. Proof, in a stranger's careful cursive, that a decade of ordinary devotion doesn't disappear just because someone tries very hard for 18 months to convince a grieving child that it never happened at all. That's my story. My stepson, manipulated by his grieving grandmother, told a judge I was never really his mother, and 11 years of a retired teacher's careful attendance records were the reason a judge disagreed, and the reason I got to watch him cross that stage after all. If you've ever had someone try to use a child's grief, or your own, as a weapon to rewrite a relationship that was real, I want you to hear this clearly. Showing up, consistently, for the unglamorous, unwitnessed days nobody's keeping score of, is not erasable just because someone with a louder story tries hard enough to erase it. The truth doesn't need permission to remain true. Sometimes it just needs someone to have written it down. If this story moved you, subscribe to True Family Drama. Tell me in the comments whether you've ever had to prove a love that should never have needed proving, and I'll see you in the next one.